suppose we're at a very particular time, aren't we? Because at last we have a UK Labour government with quite a lot of, I'm not sure how many Labour and Co-op MPs there are, but also
42.
Sorry?
42.
42. Thank you, Casey. I knew somebody would know. And then there's an opportunity. There are opportunities there which perhaps there weren't 6 months ago.
Sadly, one of the things we lack is a cross-party group on co-ops and mutuals. We had the first, when I established it, ours was the first in Wales. Scotland came second, Northern Ireland came third, and on 2 occasions I got the 3 of them together to talk about it. There still isn't one in Westminster. So one of the things we could perhaps try and persuade our co-op MPs, Labour and co-op MPs to do, is to set up a cross-party group. I believe there's one on credit unions, and there's one on mutuals, but there's not one on actual co-ops.
Well, that seems like a very good starting point.
One small point seeking clarification. In our last co-op manifesto for the last Senate elections, we emphasised the Welsh Marcora law. But recently, I think there was comment that whether it was actually within the competence of Welsh government. And I do think that we need to clarify if we are to be proposing a Marcora law in Wales, that it's actually within the competence of Welsh government. 100% sure that it is. Otherwise, we'd look very foolish.
My view is it's not within the competence, because we've got some tax powers now, so we could do something that gave some sort of tax advantage. We could play a little, we could change corporation tax for companies that were prepared to do that and engage in putting some money aside in some way. But benefits we don't control. We don't hold the benefits budget, so we can't just do it through the benefits system, which is how they do it there. So it would be tricky. The only way I think we would have the competence is to set up a sort of Marcora fund, which then came off an entirely separate budget, and we could provide that money, as investments to saving businesses straight off a Welsh government budget. But we'd need to see Welsh government's overall budget go up first. We'd never get it through otherwise. So I suspect we've got the competence if we're prepared to use our own Welsh government money. We don't have the competence to do it through the benefit system, which is what they do in Italy.
It would be then a mistake to call it a Marcora because it doesn't parallel the Italian example.
Yes, and we'd probably be mocked if we called it a Marcora law when it isn't a true example of that. We could call it something else, but as I say, I just can't see Welsh government suddenly putting a load of money aside for enterprises like that. We'd also need to make sure that money came, because we wouldn't be doing it like Marcora where you don't get any benefits, because we couldn't take away people's benefits for 2 years. We would be investing in organizations that haven't got that really sort of 100% commitment that's going to come from people who know they've got no benefits. They've got to get through 2 years here because there's no benefits waiting for them, and they're going to be scratching around for the worst job. So they're going to put an enormous amount of effort into setting up a co-op. They're also going to make really sure before they start that it is financially viable. So their chances under the Marcora law in Italy of a business going badly is much smaller than we would get here. So we could end up then with losing quite a lot of money where the businesses went wrong, and that would be disastrous in policy terms. Apart from it being a waste of money, disastrous in policy terms because there would be damage to the whole idea of setting up co-ops, which would last for a number of years. I mean, the Ben co-ops, which were never really proper co-ops if you actually look at their legal structure. The workforce were never allowed a seat on the board. It was always a partnership between politicians, civil servants, and trade union officials, and none of those are particularly known for their business skills. So that's one of the reasons why they did so badly. If the workforce understand the business, wherever you go, if you want to find out what needs changing, ask the ordinary workers.
You see the main obstacle, Alex, as being access to finance, or that the fact that anybody who's thinking of setting up a business or working in a business, or a business owner who is looking to retire, they don't think co-op.
Some of them think employee ownership, and there are specific tax advantages for employee ownership that don't apply to worker co-ops. And I'm very ambivalent about employee ownership. So I can see there are some strengths. There's been attempts to demutualize a number of co-ops, including Co-op Group. No one's ever tried it with John Lewis because they know they can't do it, because they've got a set of outsiders who actually own and control it. So I can see in terms of maintaining it in that sense. But on the other hand, the workforce aren't engaged in the same way. It's a very paternalistic attitude to the workforce. They're not actually in charge of the business. And I think some of the struggles that we see now with John Lewis would be solved if the workforce were more engaged, because they know the state of retail, they know the state of the high streets, they know where their locations are right and where their locations are wrong. And I don't think the great and the good who sit on their board understand that in the same way. So I think finance there can be tricky. And as I said also right at the beginning, particularly in the worker co-op movement, you've got a small number of people trying to raise a large amount of money. So you need a sympathetic investor or lender. And whilst we normally work on loans, and there's a little bit of investment that's done by the Development Bank of Wales into conventional businesses. But if you go to the bank, an ordinary bank, even what we call the Co-op Bank, which was once owned by, was never been a co-op, but was once owned by the Co-op Group, and isn't anymore. Even there, where they're more sympathetic for history, they don't really understand co-ops, and they don't know how to fund it. And they will always ask, what's your security? What's your house worth? Will you put your house up? All this stuff. They don't look at co-ops in that same way. So I think that, that is a problem. So funds that will be targeted at co-ops, so that managed by people who understand co-ops, would be really, really important.
I just a couple of questions. One is, do you think that one of the reasons why, particularly around worker cooperatives, that we have so few is because it's so easy to set up a limited liability company? So if 1 or 2 people, usually one person, because we've got, I think the last time I looked at it was probably 30 years ago, something like 7 million small companies that were owned and run by 1 or 2 people. But it was very easy for them to actually go and do it online and create it. Create a cooperative is really quite difficult. I remember a friend of mine who had, well, it's a long story, but to cut it short, was an expert in the structure of companies. And he indicated that companies that grow generally are set up by a group of people who have different roles, which seems to match a more cooperative model than it does a limited liability model. But the ability to register a co-op online and to manage it online is difficult compared to a limited liability company in this country. The other question is, going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, do you think rather than loans, there should be some mechanism for having shared risk within cooperative groups?
a number of really important and interesting questions there. First thing, on a purely technical basis, whilst co-op societies, I think all of us would regard within the movement as being the best form of forming a co-op, worker co-op or consumer co-op, because it really does integrate the principles, particularly of common ownership, very well. There are lots of co-ops that are set up under company legislation for the very reason that it's cheap and simple.
Yeah.
So I've been involved in one that was a limited liability partnership, which works in a very cooperative way. In fact, ordinary limited liability partnerships are really quite cooperative in their structure, but they only really work for the self-employed. So it's a form of group self-employment. If you want to be on PAYE, then you end up with normally with a guarantee company, which means you don't build up an asset base that either sits in members' ownership or sits in common ownership for distribution in the future. So whilst you can do a co-op under company law, societies are the best. And I absolutely agree with you. Societies are so difficult to set up, so difficult to manage, and also so difficult to close down. There's so many complicated processes involved. And unlike companies, they are actually regulated. Whilst Companies House is officially the regulator of limited companies, it doesn't ever do anything. If M Mouse and D Duck want to fill in the forms online for Rip-Off Enterprises Limited, it'll go through without a nod. And if you want to put in things, then by changing your mems and arts that are breaches of company law, you just register them, and then nobody will read it and nobody will know. Whereas with societies, everything that you do will be thoroughly checked to make sure it complies both with the law and with cooperative principles. So it's in a sense better, but it is so complicated. Now, the current review of cooperative legislation that's taking place, David and I have both been, I think Chris as well, been involved in some of that work with the Law Commission. That's going to come out with a consultation document soon, and part of that is going to be who should be the regulator. So should it stay with the financial with the FCA, which is part essentially of Treasury and the Bank of England, or should it come to Companies House? Should it be regulated as tightly? Should we have the same level of transparency? Because it cuts both ways. There's no transparency with co-op societies. If you go online, you can see a list of who are the directors of companies. You can see who else, which other companies they're directors of, but you can't do that with societies. So there's limitations in both ways. It certainly needs sorting out. Now, the second thing you were talking about, as I recall it, was some form of risk investment.
This was the idea of the only access it would appear that cooperatives have is loans and bank, but shared risk and accelerated growth is not something that I can see happening too much within a straightforward worker cooperative.
No. But of course, our attitude to worker co-ops generally, although it's not in any legislation, our general attitude is that a worker co-op should be 100% owned by the workforce.
Yeah.
And the continental view is that a worker co-op should be 51% or more owned by the workforce. So the idea of outside capital is perfectly normal in France, Spain, Italy.
Yeah.
It's quite accepted. And in Mondragon, they have a system when people set up a worker co-op of it really, strictly speaking, not being a worker co-op at all, because almost all the shares will be owned by other co-ops within the group. And then they'll have a transfer plan so that as they progress and as they make profits, then the others have an agreement that they will pass the shares back to the workforce, obviously, being paid back on those shares. So they have that sort of plan, but that's because they work in a very tight, very friendly federal structure where they have lots and lots of interchanges between the co-ops within the structure. It's hundreds of co-ops within the Mondragon group joined in this federal structure, enables them to do that. So I think the idea of changing our legislation so that we can take outside investors as perfectly normal would also be really, really useful, as long as they stay in a minority and they can't actually control the business.
few points, sticking close to the Marcora law, if I may, Alex, because I think that's a really interesting and profitable area for us to take an interest in. It's where the co-op can make a difference. And it's like an alignment of the stars. You get the opportunity when you get in the UK, your Labour and cooperative government. So we might have a 5-year alignment, and the alignment is at its strongest perhaps early. In others, there's less alignment in year 5 when we're all struggling for elections, or Welsh Labour is having its own elections in 26. So, and I think if we don't all understand the concept of Marcora law, and I don't claim to be expert or anything else on it, but I've got some understanding, I think we need to all get up to speed broadly about it so that it's a good starting point. And you've helped the discussion on that today. Thank you. I wasn't precisely sure to what extent we can do it in Wales, and I take your hint. But for me, nevertheless, I'm thinking of 4 areas where we can bring about more cooperative development. And it's going to involve aspects of education, aspects of civil service, aspects of legislation, which Wales can do, and aspects of funding, which Wales can or cannot do. They can do it if they get the funding, or they cannot do it. So we've got to look at those 4 areas. And then the concept of the Marcora law, because I think there are other aspects, and you'll inexpertly be able to correct me or help me. I understood not only was there a fund in Italy, but there was a right or a presumption of being able to take over or purchase a business where an owner of the business was saying, I'm retiring, I want to get rid of the business, or I'm selling up, I want to get rid of the business. And so if we need the legislation, then that should fall within the scope of Welsh Labour, presumably, to do something about that. In terms of creating a fund, I think Welsh Labour could do something about it, albeit it would be a tiny fund. I take your point. It wouldn't be on the benefits side. I take your point there. So that needs, but while we got the alignment, can we do something? And if we focused on this, we could get something done, perhaps. I think the stymieing process comes from 2 areas in terms of education, because now I think it was Sarah asked the question, is it a resource problem or an understanding and otherwise? And I think to some extent, Sarah, I think it's probably both of those, but I think it's education lets us down every time because so few people understand what we're trying to say or do cooperatively. And the civil service, Sarah and everybody, in Wales and in England, personally, what I know and feel, and having been a civil servant and seen it, I'm a civil servant in the magistrates' courts, and then what I hear from others, and I think we might be just talking to ourselves in a second, so I've got to be careful, but because we've got to be truthful about it. But my perception is that the civil servants don't understand it, don't take an interest in it, and therefore revert to type, and they just say, a bit complex, don't get it. I think I'll just stick with proposing the usual sort of model of business, and on we'll go. So we've got to look at education. Wales can do some of that, but England as well. We've got to look at the civil service. That'll be in both a Welsh and an English civil service. Legislation, we can do some of that. And it touches on procurement as well, because I think you've got to change the whole ethos and concept and terminology. And at the moment, procurement will always seem to push us to who is going to do this cheapest. I know we talk about this time and time again, but procurement has got to be talking about the environmental impact and the social impact. Because at the moment, we just let all the cowboys and the capitalists just do everything cheaply, and we're just absolutely inundated by a load of rubbish. So the concept of social and environmental impact has got to somewhere drive a coach and horses through what we think and do, social and environmental impact. And at that point, either any comment, Alex, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
On procurement, it was really started by the GLC, the idea of socially biased procurement. And Thatcher put a stop to it with a piece of legislation that said public sector procurement has to be based entirely on price. Now, that legislation has been undone for a number of years, and you can take into account social and environmental parts of how you do that bidding. But our civil servants haven't really caught up. And in Wales, we set up something called Value Wales, which is the centralized electronic procurement systems that they set up, like Sell to Wales, which some of my colleagues at the time when I was working with people who were bidding on that process called it Buy from England. Because the procurement processes were such that only the larger organizations, and most of the organizations in Wales are much smaller, could really get through this process. So the processes that we set up in Welsh government were contrary to what was our written policy. So we've always had that, ended up just buying the cheapest. And you can put in social and environmental procurement issues, and they can be really quite simple. You know, one of the things is, you know, the workforce mustn't travel more than 10 miles to work, or, you know, the supplies must come within a 50-mile radius. These are very simple, rigid things to put into a contract for procurement, and it would completely change the way we work. But nobody's actually doing it. And I agree with you, there was a lack of understanding. One of the things we did in the 2014 Social Care Act in Wales was put forward a preference for cooperatives and social enterprises to supply social care in Wales. And now the Welsh government is pressing for the idea of removing the profit from childcare. Well, co-ops make a profit. It's a modest profit, and it's a shared profit. It's not an outside extractive profit. It's shared amongst the participants, the members, which in social care co-ops can include the recipients. It can include the service users and other related bodies. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding there by civil servants and politicians as to what co-op is, because they promoted it in 2014 and now they're trying to eliminate co-ops and leave it only to charities. So that sort of education that is really, really important to get people to understand what a co-op is. That it's not, you know, some bits, other forms of business have got advantages on, but co-ops have got lots of advantages. And if you understand that, then you would do an awful lot more procurement. And one of the easy ways of doing that procurement, the other thing that I've mentioned in tweets and other bits of blog in the past, is what I call salami slicing. You know, it takes a little bit more effort when instead of putting out a 27 million design and build contract for a new hospital, you can try putting out a contract for groundworks. You can try putting out a contract for supply of concrete. You can try putting out a contract, you know, break it all down to pieces, and also give a bit of time so that people can actually, you know, mull this over and see what they can do. And in some cases, you would get cooperative consortiums coming together to provide some of that stuff. Give it time, break it down in small pieces, and you'll get a change. But again, I don't think either politicians or civil servants really understand how that could be done as a mechanism. And it's a little bit more work for civil servants, but not a huge amount. So they fall back, as you said quite accurately, you know, on I don't understand all this. It's too complicated. I just do what we've always done. And you end up with conventional business all the time.
Thanks, Alex. Or you end up with the presumption that if it's going to have a social purpose, it must be a charity.
Yes, all the time.
Yeah.
All the
Yeah.
time. I know. And you know, in many ways, there's nothing wrong with charities. I've run a care charity for a few years, you know, but they're different, and they have a different mentality, and you can't get the workforce engagement. Cartrefi Cymru is a care charity, and they've tried to make themselves into a co-op, and they've got close enough to a co-op as you can possibly get within a charity structure, and enough to convince Co-ops UK that they can call themselves a co-op. You know, they've done their absolute very best. But the basic principle of charity law is that the recipients of charity shouldn't be anything to do with running the organization, and it should be outsiders without any interest that do it. So it's the two sets of laws are completely contrary to each other.
just to reinforce a number of points that have been made. The Law Commission, the review that they're undertaking of cooperative and mutual legislation, we've already been in touch with Welsh Government on this matter from Corps and Mutuals Wales, and they've actually agreed that they will be responding when that consultation is announced, probably mid-September, and there's going to be a 16-week sort of period for people to actually respond to that. There are 4 or 5 videos of a Robert Owen Day event on this particular matter, which is on the Corps and Mutuals Wales YouTube channel that people are welcome to look at, particularly the case studies that were done looking at housing, social care, and so on. But the last session in particular with James Wright and Cliff Mills, they were particularly, I think, helpful. Just focus on education for a moment. If you look at the Court Commission that reported in 2014 that Alex mentioned, that report did reference the importance of education after a fair bit of nudging, but there was a backtracking on the review that subsequently was published in 2015, and since then absolutely nothing has been done on that front, apart from an European Social Fund document that was produced by the Wales Corp Centre, which is now totally out of date. Jeremy Miles made an announcement in April of 23 to set up a Robert Owen Schools programme, which we actively encouraged him to do so. We've welcomed the pilot. We've actually commented extensively on the material that was actually used, but we've yet to see what the end modules look like for the primary and secondary sector. And I'm talking with Glenn Bowen about seeing if we can access those materials, and also the review that presumably has been taking place as part of that. But it's a classic example of government being short of money, 25k being made available, and within a matter of weeks, money having to be spent, and not in the most effective way, in my view, if we're actually looking very seriously how we're going to move forward on the cooperative education front. And I don't know if people actually recognise, but it needs to be placed on record that Co-op Group used to spend in the order of 23 million on member education going back to 2013. That is probably less than 2 million now. And there's a small fraction of that, if any, which is actually spent in Wales. So the main burden of people understanding, which many do not, what the purposes of a cooperative needs a lot more attention through the state funded system if we're going to make progress. And I would say that is the key issue that Labour could actually do in Wales, but it's got to be done in partnership with the schools, and it's got to be nurtured and encouraged from below. The final point I would actually make is that Alex quite slightly wrong on his history, because I think he claimed that the Scottish Cooperative Development Agency that he referred to was 1978. But West Glamorgan Common Ownership Development Association, which I wrote the Urban Aid application for, was established in 1978. Antia Tybee is another example that still exists. And there were others that both Alex and I were actually involved in, and they were funded by the local authority, with the authority putting up a percentage and central government and doing the rest of the funding for maybe a 3 or a 5 year period. And these were very successful vehicles for cooperative development. And what actually happened in the early 1980s is that local authorities became aware that a central agency was being set up in the form of what is now Compass. And basically they argued that if there was a central resource available, then local groups should use that central resource rather than having a local one. So I think there's an important story there as the way in which we failed in recognising the importance of localism. I will stop at that.
Thanks, David.
Sarah, could Chris update us on what happened at Corps UK at a strategy meeting we both attended a week last Tuesday?
Thank you. Yes, that would be great, David. Chris?
Thank you, Sarah. David had sort of encouraged me to attend the meeting so I could do this to some extent. So I felt absolutely that I ought to say something about that. Thank you. I totally agree with what David and I think Alex were getting at, because I was a union learning rep. Just before I come to that, I was a union learning rep, and Wales used to be incredibly strong on union learning reps back in the noughties up to 2010. They were created by a Labour government, Blair's government, and in 97, 98, and we ended up with over, well, in fact, could get my numbers wrong, but maybe over 200 in Wales, 200 union learning reps in Wales. And then you've got things like the GFTU, the WEA, and the ALW, Adult Learning Wales, miners' institutes and mechanics institutes. I see them in Wrexham, I see them in Manchester, all sorts of places. But they're all sort of fallen into non-use, misuse, or different uses, rather than the education process that so many of them once had proudly. So that's a massive thing for us. And that's why, for example, I am passionate, along with David, as Co-ops and Mutuals Wales, to try on every angle of education, taking the point that I'm usually ignorant. Finally, the point then that we gathered with Co-ops and Mutuals, Co-ops UK, a Tuesday, I think now a fortnight ago, and lots of people were gathered saying, how are we going to engage with our own Labour cooperative government? And lots of people were contributing and had opportunities to contribute. And I think we did conclude that there's going to need to be, across the organisation and the movement, the cooperative movement, a lot of discipline, a lot of organisation, a degree of schooling us, pulling us together, maybe through Cooperatives UK. And they recognised then that there would need to be a future meeting, maybe by Zoom, sometimes in face. So I think there should be one or two more meetings coming out of that. I'm not in charge of who is attended, who will attend, who is invited, but I want you to be aware so that if you get an invite, you think about going, or make sure you get someone to go if you can't. I'll try to go, or David will, on our behalf. And I see it as quite an important thing. We've got a Labour government. I'm getting on. We've all got to take this opportunity whilst we still can to influence a Labour cooperative government early doors. Right, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's an opportunity that won't come round. And again, of course, we have a new First Minister as well, don't we?
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't sure if KC had his hand up earlier, maybe wanted to come in before me, but I just want to promote the next sessions that we're planning, and North Wales branch have got two. The one we're planning on the 15th of October, which will be, and it's obviously an evening, and it's 6:30 start. Again, similar to your branch, that we will be having this chat and then follow on with a brief branch meeting. But it's about what future policies we would consider about halving the prevalence of obesity, certainly in Wales. And Nesta has done a report and obviously got something to share with us. And so we've invited Kate Tudor along to talk to us on that. And then we're going to follow that up with the Incredible Edibles on the 26th of November, because we think that's really important and key, that community-based, the localisms we've just talked about, really. How can we grow food locally and have public land, etc., to be able to empower ourselves and eat healthier too? So there's two parts to that. So obviously there'll be a formal invite going out with the Zoom links and flyers, etc., in time. But it's been an excellent conversation. Certainly opened lots of doors, I think, for us all to consider today. But picking up. I think the main thing I could see was that local centre, Alex, that you were talking about. what are we doing locally? And I think we're doing less of that. So how do we engage with people if we haven't got these local centres? And I think that's something we really do need to think about driving forward in Wales. So that would be the main thing I picked up from today. So thank you, Sarah.
It sounds as though we're almost got a calendar that we need to get out, David.
Well, it's someone, yes.
Yes. So we'll...
It's growing organically, we shall say, in a cooperative manner. And I'm really appreciative
Yes.
of Alex coming along today and giving his superb knowledge available to all of us and to people from North Wales that have made the event so worthwhile with their questions.
Can I just
Yes.
come in there for a second?
Please do, Alex.
It's about what I see as a fundamental weakness in our lobbying as a co-op movement, particularly Co-ops UK. Co-op Party, of course, has. It looks like you've done talk. We lower your hand in 3 seconds. Oh, fine. That's all right. Sorry. In terms of lobbying, while I was a board member of Co-ops UK, I did 2 terms. On 2 occasions, I accused them of being Co-ops Northwest. I know there's good reasons why we're based in Manchester. We did have a bit of a gain when Ed Mayo was the Secretary General, simply because he refused to move to Manchester. He stayed, I think, 3 or 4 nights a week, but he still kept his London roots and his London contacts. We don't have a lobbying office. We don't have a Co-ops UK movement office. You know, the Co-op Party has been sensible enough to have a London office. The Co-op movement in general doesn't have that. And that, I think, is a fundamental weakness in trying to get our ideas across. That and the lack of a cross-party group means that really we just get ignored at Westminster. And that's somehow or other got to change. And I think if anyone's able to get back into that Co-ops UK group, and I doubt that'll be me, because I think I made myself very unpopular calling themselves Co-ops Northwest. Do try and press that we need to get some form of lobbying done in London. You know, even if it's not a full office, if it's someone going down there on a regular basis, you know, getting a pass from someone, being able to get around and talk to MPs, then we're going to get a lot further than we will get otherwise.
Thanks, Alex. Very good point. I think time is moving on. So I think it's probably just for me to thank Alex. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. That's been a really thought-provoking and I hope fruitful event. So can I just thank you all and ask branch members to stay on for a bit. And everybody else, we will see you soon. See you at the next one.